Good morning. Oh, that was pretty good. I'm impressed. We'll try it one more time, though. Good morning. All right. Well, we may have a few more people trickling in. I don't know if you like me. I had to stay in Canton and was utterly shocked that there's actually rush hour trying to get into Potsdam this morning. Then I had to get across the bridge, which was one lane, and took me about 15 minutes to get through. But it's a beautiful town, and a couple times I've been here a couple times now. But I always love being back in Potsdam, and love being at the Conference for Instructional Technology. I have heard great things about it. It's my first time here, and my thanks to the CPD team and Lisa, Michaela, Brian, Nancy for all the great work they do. How about a round of applause for them in pulling all this off? And our great chair, Janet Nepke, who's done a wonderful job, so thanks to you for all you've done as well. And so thank you for joining us this morning to talk about this idea of how do we move from competition to collaboration. My name's Jason Lane. I'm a professor at the University of Albany, a longtime student of higher education, administration, and policy. The last 4 years, I've had the great privilege of working with Nancy Zinfer down at SUNY System Administration, trying to implement this idea called systemness. You may have heard of it. We talk about it every once in a while, but the idea, how do we create something that is greater than the sum of its parts? But systemness, to me, is more than just thinking about how do we get 64 campuses to work together or 32 campuses to work together, but it's really about how do we create collaborative environments? How do we create structures that allow folks to work together? How do we create enabling environments that break down silos and help faculty think about their role in the enterprise and help staff think about their role in the enterprise differently than what we have in the past? Because our structures have really created an environment that in many ways have led us to compete with each other, whether it's for students, whether it's for resources, whether it's for ideas or initiatives. But the environment that we're in now is changing so rapidly in such a way that we have to be more collaborative, we have to be more strategic, and we have to think more about how do we share resources and work together to make things happen. So I want to start, this is the Conference on Instructional Technology, so I'm going to use, for the first time, some instructional technology. All right, so if you get your cell phones out, hopefully this works. A slide should come up here, and it's going to ask you, do you like to collaborate? It's a very basic question, yes or no. So you can think about this for a while now while we're waiting. Oh, it's actually percentages. So we might have many people. I hear some tweets going out, so I would suspect that almost everyone's going to be an A on this one. Oh, we're working now. All right. All right, so no surprise. Everybody in the room likes to collaborate. You may have felt some peer pressure from the person next to you to say that, or just the nature that's why you're here. You're self-selecting into a topic on collaboration. More so, I think, did everybody get this to work? Anybody have any problems with it? Jim did. All right. All right, so let's go to the next one and try this. Well, apparently, somehow this is... Here we go. So this is for, how do you see your own campus? How collaborative do you see your campus? Is it very collaborative, somewhat collaborative, or is it not collaborative at all? Or your organization, if you're with an organization? All right. Good. Well, thank you all. I'm just thrilled that this worked. This is not my sort of thing, so I'm really excited to see this is happening. And it seemed pretty easy, I think. But so this is interesting. Folks are sort of middle of the road. Either you're non-committal, or you think that your campus is somewhat collaborative, but not overly collaborative, and of course could be more. Anybody want to talk about this a little bit? Your thoughts on the collaborative environment at your campus? Or organization? There's a cone of secrecy over this room and the 5 million people watching streaming right now. Yeah.
Does it matter if the high administration is substantively committed to such a venture? In other words, what I'm trying to get at, there can often be a disconnect between what is said
Yes.
and the practice of it.
Absolutely.
is that going to be a factor here in trying to figure out whether you have a large mass of people who are that, or you get a few folks and then over time something more aggressively?
Okay, that's good. Leadership is critical. I mean, it's not absolutely necessary at the top, depending on what the initiative is. You can do it within your own department or within your own organization. But if you're really thinking about widespread collaboration and creating a culture of collaboration, leadership does matter. Yeah, you're absolutely right. However, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, it is often a good way to do it is to start with a small team around an initiative to build a team around collaboration and then build out from there, to get them to model the way a bit in terms of showing how a collaborative practice might work. You're right, we can't turn an entire university or college on a dime and just tell everybody overnight they're going to be collaborative. But leadership matters, and starting with small teams to structure them the right way really helps to facilitate the creation of a collaborative culture. Good question. Others? It's a quiet group this morning. All right, we'll keep going. So the world's changing. And in many ways, our country has been no more polarized now than it has in a long, long time. We don't know where it's going, but certainly we feel a lot of this polarization that's taking place, and that's sort of the nature of our electoral system, but it's in the ethos, it's there. But we're also facing a time when collaboration matters. When we go to the next slide, you'll see magazine covers about, there we go, climate change. All right, the polar bear standing on the receding ice line, the wars that are occurring across the world, particularly what's happening right now in the Middle East, and some of the most massive population migration we've seen in a long, long time. These are issues that can't be solved by single disciplines, single people, single campuses. It's going to take collaboration of a great deal to actually solve some of the greatest crises facing our world. I'm falling apart. All right, next slide. Within our own country, a lot of disparity is occurring. Wealth is being more and more concentrated at the highest levels, creating a lot of concern about whether or not should I even go to college. Is it even worth it even more? Next slide. The disparity is magnified when we look at racial disparities across the decades, that more and more the wealth is being concentrated in whites and less in those who are Hispanic or black. Next slide. And the achievement gaps are showing this also. When we think about those who go to college, we see more and more obviously coming out of white populations than we do out of black or Hispanic as well. Next slide. And for those who do go to college, their success rates, those who come from minority backgrounds, their success rates pale in comparison to their white peers as well. Next slide. And yet, the way to the middle class is going to be through a college degree. Right? The idea that a high school degree is going to be what will propel one into the middle class is no longer a realistic idea. That in the coming decade, we know that the United States will fall short by 5 million workers with post-secondary education. We are in a knowledge-based economy, an innovation economy, whatever term you want to use. We know that the college degree, associate or baccalaureate, really is the step to the middle class, the step toward social mobility. So college is becoming more and more important. And to put that 5 million workers, just to give you a sense of magnitude, if you think about our completion goal at SUNY, we've talked about moving from 93,000 completions a year to 150,000 completions a year. We all know that's huge. It's a big, big ask. That's 57,000 more a year. It's nothing in comparison to the 5 million we're going to fall short of in a decade. Actually, sorry, half a decade, 2020. And this is particularly relevant for New York State. We are one of the most highly educated states, or actually, we are a state that has the most highly educated workforce, and we have the most need for the highly educated workforce. The jobs that are available largely in New York State, now obviously as you move toward the city, this becomes more and more relevant than some of the more rural areas, but where the jobs that are looking to be filled require a college degree. In fact, for New York, We have the second largest share of employment occupations that typically require a doctoral or professional degree. So not even a baccalaureate, not even a master's, but moving into that doctoral level. And yet, the pipeline of students who are coming through our doors is shrinking. In the US, we are expected to increase our population significantly. In the Northeast, we are not. And so when we hear a lot about these trends that are occurring nationally, we have got to be very, very careful to be able to parse out what's happening at a regional level. Particularly relevant when we talk about high school enrollments. This is a report that comes out from the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Education. They do a fabulous report called Knocking at the College Door, where they look at a wide range of demographic variables, including population rates, immigration rates, birth rates, death rates, the whole works. And they try to figure out what is the college pipeline going to look like in the next 20 years. And one thing we know for the Northeast is that our pipeline of students coming out of high school is shrinking. Now, New York State, we're expected to have an uptick of about 2% between now and 2028. Now, that uptick is all in the city and largely masks what is a significant decline in high school graduation rates, as you all know, up in upstate. Our populations are shrinking upstate, and so are our high school classes. What it also doesn't show you is that in our neighbors, in Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, and even western and northern Pennsylvania, the declines of high school students are looking at somewhere between 15 and 20%. It is a demographic desert that a lot of these places are facing. Now, for those colleges and universities that are existing in those locations, where are they going to go for students? Well, they're not going to stay at home anymore. So even though we may be sort of stagnant in what our high school graduation rates look like across our state, there's going to be more and more competition for those high school students because folks are going to be coming to New York wanting those students to come to their states. It's a way to offset their own declines. So competition is going to get very, very fierce. Already Maine has launched a new program which has been pretty successful for them where they're matching the in-state flagship rates of a number of neighboring states from Vermont down through Pennsylvania and Maryland. They say, if you come to us, we will give you the in-state rate of your campus. Now, fortunately for New York, our rate is so competitive, they excluded New York at this point from their program because they just didn't want to go to quite that low. So we still have a competitive advantage in terms of affordability, but competition is getting more and more fierce. And yet we need to turn to the post-traditional learner, and we're not doing a good job of it. There's a huge marketplace in the post-traditional learning environment. The National Student Clearinghouse has found that 31 million students have enrolled in college and left without receiving a degree or a credential in the last 20 years. Folks who have attempted at least one class, about a third of those are folks who have done one class and left, but they've had some experience, they've tried it, they've dabbled, they left. What a great market for us to think about tapping into, but we can't tap into them in the same way we tap into high school students. We need to think differently about how we structure our learning environments, how we reach out, how do we create access points for them to be part of our institutions. Now, a lot of these factors have led to nationally some pretty major goals being set, and you've probably heard about them. The White House has said we've got to increase completion. Lumen has said we have to increase completion. Bill and Melinda Gates has said on and on and on. We have to increase completion. We're not going to increase completion if we are looking at the same high school enrollments that we have for all these years, if we've taught in the same way that we have all these years, because we haven't moved the dial. We continue to lag internationally in terms of the education rates of our citizens. In fact, we are now at a point where we are looking at the first generation of Americans to be less well educated than the previous one. The great American dream. First generation of Americans to be less well educated than the previous generation. It's a scary thought. Doesn't mean that we have fewer people coming to college, though some of our institutions are certainly seeing declines in enrollments, but proportionally speaking, we are not keeping up with the growth of our population, and particularly in areas where we're seeing the most demographic growth in the minority populations and adult populations. Well, let's take a step back for a minute. Maybe something that makes us feel a little bit better. What is a university? What is this thing that we think will save the U.S.? When you think about a college or a university, what comes to mind for you? People. It's about people? Good. A campus, a physical environment, right? Pretty little buildings like this, big buildings like this. What else? Intellectual atmosphere, great. Research? Critical thinking. Learning outside of the classroom. George Koo once said, George Koo's a famous higher ed scholar and launched the National Study of Student Engagement. It said 50% of all learning in college takes place outside of the classroom.
Transformation.
Oh, we hope. Transformation. Transformation of people, transformation of the way we do business, our communities perhaps. Jim?
Contact with the acknowledged master, studied in the master's need.
Studied in what?
At the master's need, contact with,
Oh, content, the curriculum, the knowledge base.
well, with the experts in various.
People who know what they're talking about, right? We're transferring knowledge from the masters to students. Good. Here's what a couple people have said. Some of you may have heard of Cardinal John Henry Newman. He wrote a book called The Idea of the University about 150 years ago or so. And he said, the high protecting power of all knowledge and science, a fact and principle of inquiry and discovery of experimentation and speculation. It maps out the terrain of the intellect. Boy, does that make you feel good? I don't know, it inspires me to think about this really special organization that exists today. Abraham Flexner. Abraham wrote a famous report called the Flexner Report that led to the closure of half of all medical schools in the U.S. around 1900. He said the modern university is not outside, but inside the general fabric of our era. It is not something apart, something historic, something that yields as little as possible to forces and influences that are more or less anew. It is, on the contrary, an expression of the ages. We feel that, as well as an influence operating upon both present and future. It is something that transcends time in many, many ways. It's one of the few social institutions that's 1,000 years old and still relatively recognizable to what it looked like 1,000 years ago, when the first Western university was created, the University of Bologna in Italy. So we still have students, we still have faculty, we still have mastery, we still have knowledge attainment, we still have the same caps and gowns. But on the other hand, we change. We evolve. We serve different students. We serve them in different ways. The curriculum that we change, that we teach, changes as well. This is Clark Kerr. Clark Kerr was the first chancellor of the University of California system, also the architect of the so-called Master Plan of California. He was a little bit more cynical about the university. He said a multi-university, the term he phrased, is an inconsistent institution. It is not one community but several. Its edges are fuzzy, silos. You look at the next quote by Hutchins, who was the president of the University of Chicago. He once described the modern university as a series of separate schools and departments held together by a central heating system. I have sometimes thought of it as a series of individual faculty entrepreneurs held together by common grievances over parking. Little less inspiring, and a little bit more, I think, descriptive of how our universities often operate today. In structures, faculty entrepreneurs, the cottage industry idea, reflective of a time, in many cases, when resources were rich, when students were plenty, when we could do things we wanted to do because we had all of the resources we needed to make it happen. Time has changed. But the silos remain. All right, administratively, we often feel very, very siloed. Finance, enrollment, technology, academics, on and on and on. And then within these larger silos, there are small silos. I'll just take academics, for example, right? You think about schools or colleges that exist parallel to each other, departments within the schools. Even some faculty within departments don't talk to each other anymore. Jen and I were at a distinguished faculty business meeting on Tuesday, the faculty of our distinguished ranks, and one of them put his hands up and he said, I love coming into this meeting once a year because I get to talk to other people. When I go back to my campus, I talk to no one. And not because I don't want to, because simply the opportunities don't exist. Can you give me more opportunities to collaborate, to interact with people? And I thought, wow, what are we doing that's wrong? Man, this is not why we joined higher ed. I don't think we all wanted to sit in our offices and do nothing. But for whatever reason, the structures, the environments, the cultures that have been created have often led to a place where people feel isolated and not working together. And in many ways, this has led to a focus on isolated approaches and impacts. If you think about funding agencies, right, they want to pick the best one project to fund, and we're all competing for those dollars. They're not paying for scale, they're not paying for implementation of best practices, they're paying for the best new idea. Researchers compete with each other, so their university gets the overhead to fund the rest of the university. We all compete for students, because students bring tuition dollars. We don't think about how do we collaborate on many of these initiatives. We inherently compete with each other all the time. And that's created some false dichotomies across our institutions in many, many ways, that these disciplines are all independent, separate from each other, they don't interact. One of the reasons why I joined SUNY System, I had the privilege of working with Tim Killeen, who at the time was Vice Chancellor for Research for SUNY and President of the Research Foundation, and he had been asked to work on a task force for the governor around, it was New York's NYS 2100. It was about how do we prepare New York to be more resilient against extreme weather events. And Tim's task, and he asked me to help him on it, was how do we actually harness the collective capacity of SUNY to help inform this commission to think about resiliency. And that led us to think about, well, what does that mean, resiliency in extreme weather? Who all needs to be involved? And it's more than just thinking about what predicting the weather looks like, right? The meteorologists, atmospheric scientists. It's about mental health, the people who are affected by this. It's about infrastructure, making sure we're building roads the right way and buildings the right way. It's about making sure we've got crisis management teams in place and that we've trained our leaders effectively. We pulled on disciplines from across business, from across science, from across education to come together and say, how do we create a resiliency plan for the state of New York that will effectively respond to extreme weather? It wasn't just tapping one expert or another, it was creating a team of people that cut across not just disciplines but campuses, because the collective wisdom that is stored across SUNY is so great that unless we can find a way to bring it all together in these sorts of cases, we really aren't going to create a lot of change. And that actually gave birth to what we call the networks of excellence down the road. How do we actually build multi-campus collaboration so that we can really think differently about the way in which we do research? But we also have other false dichotomies. One you all are probably often familiar with, effective teaching and advising is separate from technology, right? Faculty go off and do their thing and they expect people on the tech side to build the blackboards and the learning systems and whatever infrastructure they might need, and it's just going to work for them. Well, we know that doesn't work. We've got to have more collaboration. We have to have discussion. We have to have partnerships, right? Those who are working on the technology side need to understand the needs of the faculty, and the faculty need to understand how to effectively use the technology. We invest millions in a technology, and yet we don't always do a great job of training people about how to use it, and the technology isn't always responsive to their needs either. We've got to think more about how do we work together to build effective collaborations. Another false dichotomy, higher education is for the public good or private gain. It's both, right? We know all of these things are both. Enrollment management, faculty, and teaching. Faculty used to think, I'm just going to show up in a classroom like this and students will be there. It's not my job to make sure enrollments are up, right? It's the people over in admissions to make sure enrollments are up. But the reality is that's not true. We know faculty are important to the recruitment process, more importantly to the retention process, and they have to be thinking about where their enrollment's coming from. Are their programs responsive to the needs of the market? Are they providing curriculum that makes sense to the workplace and will lead to jobs and degrees? But that requires us to have conversations with people who are recruiting students or are working with employers. You get the idea. Data stovepiped. Back to the farms. I'm an old farm boy, grew up in the Midwest. Farms knew that in order to survive, they had to grow, but they also had to be more strategic, right? They had to think about diversifying how they worked. So you have crops, you've got your livestock, you think about how do you use your crops to feed your livestock, which is where you create silos. But the silos become an effective way of creating change. But they knew if they didn't change, and it was difficult to change and expand and move beyond that classic family farm. I've got cousins now who raise 3,000 pigs for 3 months out of the year. They're part of a collaborative environment. They get shipped off to another farm that raises them for the next 3 months. It's a really fascinating environment that they're in. It's all about robotic milking now, and it's a whole new environment. But for them, it was big. It's a lot of change. But if we don't change, it's fatal. Across New York State, we see farms failing all the time. They're not changing to keep up with the times. They can't compete anymore. The resources aren't there. Higher ed, we're seeing the same thing. I've been saying this for years, that eventually we're going to see more and more schools closing. Well, it's here. You can hardly pick up a paper now, and at least once a month, if not more often, we will read about a school closing. Burlington, one of the more recent ones, school's out forever. But we see other, Killian College, Mattia College, Marion Court College, Sweetbriar College. Publics have not quite been as affected yet. But there's always discussion about closing campuses, not within SUNY. Not going there. But I've studied this across the country. States talk about it more and more frequently. Are we overbuilt? Do we have too many colleges? It's a very different time than it was in the 1960s when you saw the building of one community college a week. We didn't have enough capacity at that time. Now there's questions about, do we have too much capacity? Is the capacity in the right places? So it's an environment that we need to think differently about if we're going to survive. Now we have changed, all right? This is, anyone know what movie this is from? I hope so, a few rumbles. Animal House, right? I use this to say this is what a Facebook page used to look like, right? When you opened up a book, you saw the picture of your college student there. Of course, Facebook looks like this today. That's an external change that affected us, but certainly it's changed the way we collaborate, the way we work together, the way people interact. Millennials are all about greater collaboration and sharing, probably too much so sometimes, but it's out there. We changed in other ways, right? We used to register like this. Get up, go into a gym, stand in line, hope the person in front of you didn't get that last seat that you wanted and that class you needed to graduate. Now you don't even have to get out of bed. All right? It's all on your phone. As long as your battery's working, you're going to be just fine. You can go back to sleep when you're done. We used to teach like this. We used to put people in large lecture halls like this. Things have changed. Not everything has changed. Although we are trying to use these things more differently, and I see many of you with your laptops out there also, and I'm hoping you're not on Facebook. But the outlook isn't always great, right? We have declining enrollments. Moody's as a bond rater has been more and more important about rating colleges and universities than any accreditor or U.S. News has been actually, in terms of actually understanding what is the stability of higher education. And they say we're in tough shape. We have declining enrollments, government spending cuts are happening, and there's growing public doubt about college value. And in fact, after the recession, we saw pretty good declines across this country. New York State, immediately after the recession, didn't fare well, but it's fared well since then, at least in terms of the stability of funding relative to many other states. It's not great. We wanted it to be better. This year wasn't fantastic at all, but relative to some, we did all right. We've also got growing public concern about the value of college and university. How many of you thought in your career you would have to defend the value of a college education? I mean, actively defend it, right? Front page articles about, is it worth it anymore? Now, we know it is. We know all the data that we see. If you look at the best place to get this data is the Georgetown Center for Education and Workforce. They will show that a college, the return on a college degree is far greater than any other way you can invest that same amount of money. They've looked at, do you start your job earlier? Do you put that same amount of money into a 401k and hope it matures by the time you retire? Nothing gives you the same return on investment as a college degree will. On top of all the other benefits, right, we know that are important about a college degree, we know it's important. It's a good return on investment. It's good for our communities. It's good for people. It's good for states. It's good for economies. But people are raising questions about it. And our pipelines are getting more and more leaky. All right, so not only do we have issues within our own infrastructure, within our own colleges and universities, we have more and more problems with those who we need to collaborate with. We are struggling around high school graduation rates. We struggle around getting those who graduate into college. We struggle around getting those who get into college to make sure they complete college. And then we struggle to make sure that those who complete college have the right skills to be effective in the workforce. We spend about $80 million, we SUNY spend about $80 million a year on remediation. Just making sure that folks who are coming to us have the right basic skills to be effective in college. We need to be strengthening the pipeline from K-12 into college. We need to be collaborating more with our colleagues outside of our campuses. Students who come to us often will have attended at least one other institution. Half of SUNY's graduates, bachelor's graduates, attend 2 institutions or more in the course of their lifetime. Students swirl more and more. It's not about a student coming to you and staying with you and graduating. It's about thinking, how do we affect the student while they're with us? How do we better understand where they're coming from? How do we better understand where they're going? But it's a very different way to think about the higher education experience if we have to now think, if we're going to really be focused on student success, that means we've got to collaborate across multiple campuses. We've got to collaborate with our K-12 colleagues, and we have to work better also with the workforce to understand what their needs are. And all of these pressures are coming together on higher education at a point in time, forcing us to really think critically about changing, or if not, questioning our long-term survival. All right, so change is ahead. That's the dire story. Where do we go from here? Have I sufficiently depressed you? I don't think it's all that bad, but there are some pretty troubling signs out there we need to be aware of. All right, part of what's happened then is that the way in which we are structured, the way in which we work, the way in which we interact with students and communities no longer are optimal for a lot of their needs. We're no longer responding to the way they're experiencing higher education. There was an MIT report that came out recently that talked about education needing to move more toward interchangeable nodes. This idea that students are going to be swirling through multiple institutions, picking up credits here or there, and at some point assembling a degree at some location where they will get a credential that validates all the learning they occurred. It doesn't mean that the traditional college environment is going to go away. There are still people who want the traditional experience. I think it's a fabulous experience. They want to live on campus. They want student organizations. They want leadership opportunities. They want to live with their friends and their colleagues, and they want to go through that 18 to 22-year-old experience in the college way. But that population of people we're serving is shrinking. Fewer and fewer can afford it in the same way, and so we need to be thinking about different ways to serve those students. All right. That means we need to collaborate more and more. Next slide. So as Henry Ford said, working together is success. How do we actually create collaborative environments? How do we work together? How do we build teams that are effective? Next slide. All right, we have another poll. Now I've depressed you, we'll try to get you more interactive again. What's the biggest barrier to collaboration on your campus? There are probably others that you can think about. These are the 5 I picked. Reactions. Mm-hmm.
In order to run it, be able to carry out the basic mission, that requires greater specialization of functions the bigger it gets. So it seems like if the more complex something gets to the side,
Mm-hmm.
more specialization is required.
Yep.
The harder it's going to be in certain ways to achieve the integration than in the sense you get what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
So I guess, could you address that? That seems to be a dynamic that you've got to deal with and try to get a collaboration.
Yeah.
Your vision.
Spot on. I mean, it's true, right? If you think about it, when you're in a small team, you're forced to work together and collaborate more so just because it's easier for one to get everybody around the table. As you build and you build out, you become more and more specialized, which actually becomes more and more important to be purposeful and thoughtful about how do you maintain collaborations. It doesn't happen as naturally as it once did. Not everybody can get around the water cooler and talk about what happened the night before, right? Which leads to other conversations about how do we collaborate, what are you doing, how do we work together. You have to structure environments. You've got to have leadership who rewards and thinks about collaboration. It's about putting teams together that are multi-departmental, let's say. I mean, a lot of it is focusing on projects in a way that cross departmental boundaries and bring people together from across those boundaries to work collaboratively on projects. But you have to be very thoughtful. I'll talk a little bit about this, about structuring these things in a way that helps to enable collaboration. It doesn't happen as naturally. You're right, the larger we get.
The big answer seems to me to almost be two separate things.
Yeah?
There is a fear of loss of control, and then there is a lack of trust.
Mm-hmm.
I actually wonder, had you split that up, what the percentages would be there, because the lack of trust seems to be maybe larger than the fear of losing control in some instances.
I think you're absolutely right that it's a horrible survey question because it is actually confounding two ideas, and I need to separate that out next time. They are complementary, I think, at times, but you're right. People may, that fear of, that lack of trust actually may be a much greater impact than the fear of loss of control for some.
Your idea of lack of clarification, I wonder if it means lack of substantive vision. The slogan or an aphorism is not a vision. A vision
Fair.
shows how you're going to do something.
Right.
And a lot of times what we get are aphorisms. We're not getting, okay, this is how you do it. You don't get detail.
I didn't plant this, by the way, but that's where I'm going next.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. I'll just give this over to you. You've got this whole, no, I mean, you're thinking all the right way, which is great. Jim.
I'm inclined to tie some of this back to our addiction to growth as a necessity.
Okay.
I earlier wanted to ask you, why on earth a farm needs to grow to survive if there aren't shareholders?
Right.
A successful farm, just remaining the same size, should be just fine. And in our context, it's the order of returns. You know, we don't explore things together across silo barriers.
Yep.
In part because of if we can't demonstrate an increase in enrollment in a particular class of the institution next quarter, we're not going to get support.
Yeah.
And that's almost the primary motive today is to grow. I want to
So for a farm, in part, the margins on the return on investment are shrinking more and more so. So you have to have larger economies of scale to have any sort of long-term revenue stream to occur. The other is no, but to support yourself and your family and everybody who's working for you, right? The costs of it are more and more. The costs of running a farm are increasing, so you've got to increase your revenue streams to be able to make up the costs. The other is also, right, if you're only into crops and you have a bad season because the weather was horrible, you could be, you're on such fine margins, right? You could just lose your farm. And so you've got to think about how do I diversify revenue streams. In many ways, higher ed is moving in the same environment in the fact that, our margins are getting smaller, the costs are getting higher. States are, particularly higher ed, are defunding higher education across the country, and so we've got to think about alternative revenue streams. Privates for a long time have known that enrollments are where you get a lot of your revenue from, in addition to alumni donations and other donations. We have a mentality often that, in order to grow, the state should pay us to do that. That's no longer what's going to happen. And so if we got to think about other revenue streams, then we have to think about, do we grow our student base? Now, you have to also offset that with costs associated with it to make sure that it's actually worthwhile and you've got the space capacity to do it, which is where online learning comes into play, because We have more space online than we might have in a physical campus to be able to do it. There's a lot of factors that play into all of this that we could probably spend a couple of hours talking about. But one thing we do know is that if we continue to focus on the traditional college environment with the traditional pipeline of students coming out of high school, those enrollments are mathematically cannot increase.
We've lost the emphasis on quality over quantity.
Well, that's okay. The problem is we can't. Well, I'm glad you called that out, right? Because we can't sacrifice quality for quantity. We have to think about how do we at the same time ensure that there's still high quality programs and academically rigorous programs, and that the quality is there, but it just is going to be manifested in a different way. I'm not a proponent of sacrificing quality for quantity at all. And this has happened globally at times. Governments have rewarded institutions for completions only. Just the more you complete, the more money you get. And we have seen exactly this. Quality declines. More people get through with lesser ability because the reward structure is set up to reward quantity over quality. We have to be careful to avoid that.
And so the surrounding culture loses interest.
Right. Yeah, agreed. All right.
Could I add a comment to your,
Yeah, please.
if I may be so bold?
It'd be great.
I think that there is a lack of critical thinking,
Among?
both populations. We're not turning out critical thinkers,
Yeah.
and we ourselves are the victims. We really are compartmentalizing these silos. My own campus, for example, I have this perennial issue that our administration does not understand that there are areas where there is growth.
Yep.
And I asked, at the latest meeting, I asked the provost, how come is it that you keep telling us that we're losing students when at the graduate program level, we are not? And I was told that those data are not looked at. And I said, well, then how on earth do you expect us to disseminate the success stories that we can share when that information is not available? I did an analysis of our enrollment, since our graduate program began, and they mirrored what SUNY is projecting until 2017.
Yep.
That they can provide. And yet, my ideas are not being heard. So I believe that we need more directives, if that is the proper term. Just like the welfare system, if you're gonna monitor how this is properly implemented, you're gonna have more people out in the field, understanding what the needs are of the population that's up,
Agreed.
for this.
Right.
So I believe that because of the size of the system,
Yep.
some campuses are not being assisted properly to disseminate their success story.
Well, I think that's a problem higher ed has overall is, and this is something I can get a soapbox and just bore the rest of you for half an hour on this. We don't do a good enough job telling our stories. We don't do a good enough job of telling our successes. We are easy to point out where there are faults and failures, but as soon as we have something that goes well, we think that's great, and we move on, and somebody will find out about it. But the reality is we've got to tell more about why higher ed is great. We have to talk more about the successes of our students, the successes of our faculty. I've been working with a group called The Conversation, which is a recent upstart. It's based out of Australia, but they've been here in the U.S. now for a couple of years, that actually work with faculty to write 1,000 to 1,500 word articles based on their research that then they republish in Times and Newsweek and Washington Post. The whole idea is, how do we highlight the work of our faculty, make them seen as experts, which then promotes our campuses and get people excited about the work that they're doing. These are the sorts of things that we need to be doing a better job of in terms of talking about successes and holding them up. And I agree with you, some of our smaller campuses, just across the board, need more help in a lot of areas, and that's where system can play a role. We don't have all the resources in the world to be able to do it, but these are the things that we're trying to think about.
You could have looked at this now by adding Dowling College.
Adding what?
Dowling College, I don't know, just closed.
Oh, Dowling, yes, you're right. Yeah, right, they're just happening more and more. It's kind of scary, actually. All right, here's another one, and where I know we're actually running a little bit short on time. What are the biggest barriers to successful implementation and planning, right? So this is the idea of how do we move from vision to implementation? How do we make things happen on campus? We won't talk about this one as much. We'll keep going, but I want to see, just curious what folks' reactions are. And I realize B is another double question, but the idea is just, do you have support and buy-in elsewhere? And buy-in seems to be a big one. Culture. All right, so really it looks like the whole idea of buy-in around collaboration, around implementation is a big piece of this. Culture and limited capacity, capacity issues to deliver. Okay, good. So let's shift, and I'd like to talk about that, but I know we're running short on time, to where do we go from here? The first idea I always come out with is I think you got to dream big. You've got to think about what the big vision is. There's a president of the University of Indiana, Herman Wells, who talked about at the end of his career, one of the things is you can make no small plans because they'll never get done. Because everybody will tear a small plan apart. You have to think big so that people see themselves as part of the plan. They can understand how they fit in. And that's, I think I have the next slide here. Next slide. We do see more and more big plans being put out there. We have our SUNY plan, of course, the 150,000. But when I first heard about this, University of Minnesota 15 years ago came out with a plan. They wanted to be the top 3 research university in the world. Now, people laughed at the time. They weren't even top 3 in the nation. They were top 3 in Minnesota, but they had a long way to go to get to the national level or even the international level. And I can't even tell you if they actually made it or not. But people began to realize this was where we're heading. This is our goal. This is where, if we're going to be part of the team, let's figure out how my little piece of the world fits into the bigger vision of where we're heading. And you've got to make it big enough so people feel that they are collectively part of that larger goal. When we talk about 150,000 completions, part of that is setting a goal out there so that we begin to say, how do I contribute to increasing completions? How do I help students be more successful? This is what you all do all the time in the work that you do. You're always thinking about how do we rethink the learning environment? How do we make it better? That all contributes to ensuring better completion and better learning down the road. But of course, you can't have big plans. Next slide. All right, a goal without a plan is just a wish. That's to your point. We've got to figure out how do we actually make it happen? How do we execute? How do we deliver? Higher ed is not classically good at doing some of these things. We say, let's put a strategic plan in place, but we don't actually know how to implement it all that well. Right, and so more and more colleges and systems are thinking about how do we do this? How do we actually build environments that we can collaborate in? How do we actually implement the things that we want to get done? So where do we start? And we've looked at a lot of research on this, some colleagues and I. We came out a book on Higher Ed System 3.0 a few years ago. Worked on a book on collective impact a couple of years ago. We've got a new book coming out next year on higher ed systems redesign. We've been out talking to people about how do we build collaborative environments? How do we create change? How do we create initiatives that evolve in a way that brings everybody along and hopefully will advance the university? We got to ask four questions. What are we trying to do? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve? What's the vision? Where are we going? What's the goal? How are we planning to do it? We often stop at one, just what do we want to do? We don't actually then think about how do we actually plan to make it happen. Are we using data to monitor and track progress? If we don't, then how do we actually know that we are making progress? How are we creating change? Are we impacting students' lives? If our whole goal is to improve the online learning environment for students, how do we actually know we're doing that? Do we know that they're using materials more? Do we know that they're more engaged? Do we know they're more successful? Are we tracking the data? And if we're not doing it, what are we going to do to change the infrastructure so we can actually get the data to understand, are we having an impact on what's happening? If you can't measure your impact, you have no idea if you're actually making change. And you could be investing resources in areas that you don't need to invest in. Right? We need to accept the fact that we need to measure both what works and what doesn't, and if it doesn't work, let's move on. Okay. And we got to focus on the right elements. I won't walk through all of these, but you've got to lay the foundation, right? You've got to set aspirational goals. You've got to build critical capacities, establish networks of champions on your campus, people who are willing to be out there taking the lead, saying these are good things among their peers. You have to have decision analytics in place. You have to develop the plans, build strategies, develop measurable targets. Then you have to move toward implementation and engagement, right? How do you do this? This is about routine meetings and data analysis. We have to be able to check in with each other. We have to make sure we're holding each other accountable on a regular basis. You know, the academic environment very much works against us in these ways. I can remember many times One particular story I heard from a colleague of mine. They wanted to create new email addresses. This was years ago at the University of Albany. And it took about 5 years longer probably than it should have, because they would meet and they would talk at this, in the fall semester. And they would say, okay, what's our plan? And they said, well, let's come back into the semester and figure out what the plan's going to be. We need to have a plan. And by the spring semester, they would review the plan. And they say, well, we don't have time to vote on it this semester. So they would kick it down the road to the fall semester, right? And it's sort of like this endless loop of not getting anything done. In another presentation I do, I talk about the disconnect between administrators and faculty members, this thing called organizational velocity. We all work in our own timelines based upon our culture, right? Administrators, I represent as cheetahs, are under constant deadlines, move very, very quickly, often don't have time to think about where they're going, but they're under pressure to get things done. Faculty are responding more to when their classes are scheduled, when the academic paper is due, what the conference looks like is coming up, and getting my grades in, and we tend to be a little more lumbersome and slow in moving, and often those two cultures don't always connect very, very well. But we've got to figure out a better way to do that, because then we also got to create a culture of change. Nancy Zimper talks about the fact we have to be the best at getting better, which I think is a great phrase. We've got to create a culture where we're constantly thinking about how do we improve, how do we change, how do we build environments that actually enable us to be better at what we're doing, and through that collaboration. Now, this takes a foundation. A solid foundation begins with a strong and committed leader. Now, the leader could be the president, leader could be a department chair, leader could be a dean or director, whatever level you're at. But these are the skill sets that tend to be sort of most common in folks who are able to create collaborative environments that are able to implement projects that work well. You got to have a vision. What is your vision for where you're going? You have to understand the larger ecosystem. Too often we only look at what's immediately in front of us, or what is most apparent to us from our specialty, right? So, a fireman will always think the hose is the best way to put out a fire, right? The idea is you got to figure out what it is. You got to look beyond your immediate nose. I've sometimes used an iceberg to represent this, right? Too often we look only at the tip of the iceberg. We don't look at what is below the sea level, where the real problem exists. But you've got to be able to look at the larger ecosystem of what's happening. You have to think strategically, you have to embrace reflection. This is one we don't often do. We don't embrace reflection very often. We have to think, are we moving in the right direction? Part of this is being willing to accept failure. We've created somewhat of an environment where we're not always willing to accept failure. And if you're going to innovate, failure is going to happen. It's inevitable. It's part of the ecosystem. And so we have to be thinking about, we don't want everyone to fail all the time, but obviously there needs to be some room to be able to move away from something that isn't working, to redirect resources into an area that is better. We get very stagnated in our current physical infrastructures to say, well, we've always funded it that way, that's why we're going to keep funding it. Right? They've always had that many faculty members in that department, so therefore they should always have that number of faculty members in that department, without thinking strategically, is that where the best investment is? Is there growth in that area? Is that where new enrollments are being targeted? You have to make sure you have to hold everybody accountable, including yourself. You have to use data, and this is a big one. This is where you are getting toward collaboration. You have to co-create the future. It's not just your vision. It's about working with others collectively to say, what is our vision? Where are we taking the unit, whatever that unit is, department, college, office, campus, system? Collectively, what is our future, and how are we going to get there? Language matters. If you hear I all the time, it's not going to be a very collaborative environment. How do we collectively come up with a vision of the future? All right. You have to set collective priorities. You have to connect stakeholders. You have to align interests. This is one that's important, I think, is finding common ground. If you can find common ground, you can often get through a lot of the arguments. And an example I use is when we talk about seamless transfer. And some of you, I'm sure, have heard about seamless transfer. This was a big initiative that went in place 4 or 5 years ago. There was a lot of pushback against it. Folks were concerned about the way it was going to work. And there were a lot of various arguments that happened to sort of push back against seamless transfer. A lack of control, lack of trust, lack of faculty oversight. Faculty were heavily involved in making what the curricular changes were going to be. And what shifted the conversation at the end of the day was when we began to talk about student success and saying, how can we collectively move towards student success? How can we create an environment that allows students to transfer, not lose credit, not lose pace toward graduation? Because we know that students are transferring all over SUNY. 30,000 students transfer a year. They transfer in multiple directions. They transfer from 4-year to 2 years. They reverse transfer. They go 2-year to 2-year. They go to 4-year to 4-year. And when we began more and more talking about student success as our motive, as our focus, it became more and more difficult for other arguments to gain traction. Universities, we can use student success for almost anything as we think about it, because so much of what we do is focused on the student. But it's important to find common ground. That's one of the most important ones. Data. We've got to track data. We've got to do a better use of a better way of using data. Back to seamless transfer. When we were able to show the data of students moving all directions, we were better to argue why we needed a multi-directional transfer framework. Students are actually moving in different directions than just 2-year to 4-year. But we don't use data well enough, and we need to share data more so. Some of the best enrollment management offices in the country share their data widely with everybody on campus, particularly faculty members. They create funnel reports so that every couple of weeks or a month, you as department should know, what does your funnel look like? And by funnel, I mean how many people have applied to your department, how many people have been accepted, how many people have actually accepted the acceptance, how many people are going to be showing up that first day, so that you see what your enrollment looks like. You have to begin to own it, but you're not going to own it if you don't know what the data looks like. You know, if I don't know that my enrollment is going down, I'm not going to be able to step up and help think differently about it. I'm not even going to be motivated to do it. You've got to share data. And all of this comes through in terms of creating implementation plans that are collaborative in nature. Okay. Part of this is starting with small teams, and how do we structure small teams that work well? And I'm jumping ahead a little bit just because we're running low on time. But you have to have folks who are on the team who have complementary skills and capacities. If you build teams that have all the same people on it, it's not going to be a very good team. It's not going to move forward in a way. You need people that have different skill sets, but they're complementary to the project. You need backing of senior leadership. It doesn't necessarily mean the president, it could be the dean, but people need to know that the work they're working on is being supported by the people above them, and that they're going to be supported by them. They need to have freedom to function outside the chain of command. This is one that just irritates the heck out of me because I hate chains of command personally. But people need to be able to talk to others without being in trouble for not talking to their boss. Now, keep the boss in the loop, right? The boss needs to know what's going on. But you all have probably seen environments where some employers and bosses think, boy, you talk to me, I'll talk to that person over there for you, and then report back to you, right? That just slows things down. If you're really going to create collaborative environments, people need to be able to talk to each other across offices. At SUNY, we actually have a really great collaborative environment. Folks who have worked at System know this. In fact, because we don't have enough staff to do all the work, and so much of the work we do cuts across divisions, we are all the time talking to each other. It doesn't matter what office we're in or who reports to whom. Half the time people don't even remember who reports to whom because we have such a matrix environment of people talking to each other and collaborating, be able to advance projects just because we have to do it that way, but it's a great environment to be in. It works well. And then you have to think about what's the positive impact. What are you actually doing that's going to affect change, right? What are we doing? It's not just about getting together and talking. It's about actually figuring out what we're doing to affect positive change on our campus or our system. And so a lot of this does require a culture shift. A lot of it, it's easiest if you can do it from top down. Somebody comes in and says, we're going to create a culture, an environment that is collaborative, that embraces change, that thinks about how do we improve ourselves. But it can also be grassroots, right? It doesn't just need a president. You can do this within a school. You can do it within your own organization. You can create pockets of collaboration if you want them to occur. But again, it's about getting people focused on shared agendas, shared goals, shared implementation strategies, and shared success so that we all collectively understand where we're going and why it benefits us and where we work. I was going to talk a little bit about the fact that a lot of things that we are doing now are very collaborative in nature. Open SUNY, I think, being one of them. It's about not just new technology, but it's about how do we bring people together to think differently about online learning? How do we collectively learn from each other? The Center for Online Teaching Excellence, I think, is a great example of this. How do we build collaborative teams that cut across campuses, cut across disciplines, so that we can learn from each other and build our collective capacities to improve the online teaching environment? Another one I was going to throw up here, seamless transfer, is that so much, it's not just about the policies we put in place, but it's about the technology that undergirds it. That technology is useless unless we had the registrars to help us code the classes in the way that we needed to, so students can see how they transferred other classes. We needed people to think about shared learning outcomes so that we could put the core courses into place and be able to look at what counts for what across campuses. There's a lot of collaboration occurred that was about faculty, it was about technology, it was about registrars. Otherwise, this would not have happened. Open educational resources, analytics, I'll just jump through some of those things. We have like 5 minutes left, so are there questions? The idea here, I think, and we're happy to share the slides with folks, though, is the way we've historically been structured leads us to be in an environment where we don't work well together. And the ways in which our environment was 40 years ago very, very stable enabled us to be able to be in structures that were siloed and did not have to be very dynamic and didn't have to change very much. But we are in an environment now that is extremely dynamic, that is changing all the time. The resource bases are constantly shifting. We don't know year to year what we're going to get from the state. We don't know year to year where our tuition is going to come from. We don't know year to year what tuition is going to be or how many students we're going to have. We have to be more dynamic, we have to be more nimble, and we have to be more collaborative about working across that academic core and across the support units and other staff that are working with external environments. It's a necessity. If we're going to survive, we have to think differently about the way we operate.
Certainly, I think in most places, and certainly in community colleges, the funding to change the physical structure of your environment to create those collaborative spaces.
Yep.
Where faculty and students cross-pollinate, because we're still in the 1960s cellular environment.
Right.
The way buildings are boxed and around the quad and that sort of thing. And the other thing, I think, that I would like to hear Cindy talk more about, and maybe the senior administrators, is this push for technology, which I love. I teach media arts, but no real footprint for the level of IT support and infrastructure, the blueprint model of a strong IT backbone, both for administration and for digital learning and for online learning. Because there's so much conversation that goes on, and committees doing this and that on campus, but it seems to me that SUNY probably has a pretty good eye on, if your campus is this big, the fundamental backbone for a strong IT infrastructure with this many students and this many faculty doing this level of collaborative IT work, with
Yep.
this level of online course offerings, should be this. Because I don't think that they're strong, generally speaking, really strong, high-level, CIO-type technical project management, which I see as a huge limitation that often goes unaddressed.
I think the IT side is an area we are thinking about critically, but also is an area that we know is not where it needs to be. I think there is a broad recognition that obviously some campuses have great infrastructures and others don't. And campuses that are smaller need different infrastructure than those that are larger. But beyond that, I would agree. I don't think we've gone far enough to think about some of those things. An area that I've been working in recently is predictive analytics. We're investing more and more money into these early warning systems, into the EABs and the Civitas's that say that they're going to help us understand who our students are, what they're going to do, and in real time be able to provide interventions to help them be successful and not fall through the cracks. Problem is we're investing millions of dollars in this technology, but we're investing nothing in the human capacity side of it. How do we make sure people effectively use it? How do we make sure that this is a way that we build teams that come together to think about what's the best way to use these platforms to improve student success in a real way? It's not exactly to your question, but part of what we're thinking about there is readiness assessments. What are you ready organizationally and from an infrastructure perspective to actually implement an early warning system? What is the minimum it takes to be successful with these things? I know Online Code under Kim Scalzo has done this, at least in the online learning environment, to say, okay, what's that base level foundation you need to really move into the online environment? I don't think we have that in the IT side, because everybody's moving into the IT, but I think we do need to think more about how do we get the right people around the table to say, okay, what is the base level everyone should have? And if you're going to be doing this over here, what is it you need as a backbone support? That's a great suggestion.
In combining some of those thoughts, if you want a collaborative culture, going back to sort of that community colleges are 60s style buildings,
Mm-hmm.
we don't have spaces for varied silos to get together and form a community or talk.
Right.
The whole, you go back to your office and you don't talk to anyone for a year. It's because you have no space to go to do this. And that could be something to be thought about on all campuses.
Mm-hmm.
Space is always at a premium, but I think if you want to foster collaboration and cooperation, there has to be some focus on where and how that occurs that isn't being done. And when your physical structure is against collaboration, where there's nowhere to go and sit down and share a cup of coffee together.
Right. Well, it's a really good point, and I think I've thought about more sort of that organizational dynamic of how do we try to structure it around getting things done. But I think what you're talking about is something that's really important behind them. That's relationship building. How do we create the environment that allow us to build the relationships that allow us to build trust, so that we feel better about being in collaborative environments? And I think it's a really good point.
I just wanted to mention that I think we should also look at virtual spaces because we're also dispersed all over the state.
Mm-hmm.
For campuses. Faculty use more and more online, so they're not available on campus to watch them. Space is a premium, and the point is that we have more and more virtual and augmented realities to be able to do this in a real way, that we can see each other and interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think unless we have opportunities to provide spaces where we can meet online, and then perhaps at a conference like this every year, we're sort of
That's-
losing, we may meet with other people in arts and sciences if we create a faculty place, but we're not particularly going to meet with the nanoscience people who are,
Right.
miles away for us anyway. And so you need to sort of look at new ways.
It's also about having the effective technology to facilitate that in a way that is more seamless. I mean, from a SUNY perspective, we do this all the time. Our staff is spread across the state. We work with everybody on every campus, and so we're constantly in environments where, and even in meetings, where people are located in multiple locations, and making sure that we are interacting with each other either on phone or video conference or whatnot. But that's different than even online space, like the learning commons we have, to be able to bring people together in a space where they can collectively work together. When we did the seamless transfer work with faculty members, we had 1,000 faculty members who came together to work on 38 transfer paths. We used an online learning commons space that they got together virtually, it wasn't physically, to talk through what are the core courses of their particular disciplines look like, and they worked together in that online space. I mean, I am a firm believer physical space also matters for those who are on campus, but I agree with you, more and more people are spread across the virtual environment. And as we break down the barriers that are not just campus-based, we do need to be thinking about how do we connect with people outside of campus, outside of our environments, and build collaborations that way too.
One issue you may also consider is the impact of use of technology on the various jobs and positions within SUNY. In terms of, I know trying to get basically people to take that and relieve financial pressure. One of the things it seems like you're going to look at here is going to be harder for people to buy in if they feel like there is a much more insecure job situation. If
True.
does SUNY need to also look at how do we figure out ways in which my wife made a comment last night? Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could do some transferring within SUNY?
Oh, from an employment perspective.
Right, right. So if you're within the SUNY
Yep.
system now, you might have abilities to transfer within. That might be one factor in trying to say, okay, you got to get people to buy in. It's a lot harder to buy in if you feel like the job situation is changing.
Yep. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think the transfer idea is something that's really interesting. The community college structure, the way it works, makes it a little bit more difficult because of the county-based employees than on the state op side, which everybody's in the same union. And so there's a little bit, it's not easy, but it's a little easier to transfer within the union for our faculty and staff. But I think it's a really good idea. On the flip side, part of it also, if you're going to create collaborative environments, you have to think early on, how do I bring people into this knowing we are going to collaborate, we're going to create environments that do collaborate. And so as things turn, hopefully as the higher ed cycles, as we bring people in, we have to do better about onboarding people into collaborative environments. I work with presidential searches across system, and so one of the things I've worked hard at is try to reframe all of our presidential search descriptions so that they talk about presidents are not just captains of their own ship, but they're part of the fleet of SUNY. They've got to balance these dual roles of being sort of the CEO of a campus, but part of a collaborative leadership team that is helping to advance the entire system. Trying to change how people view their roles also from the very outset. If you're going to join our team, you have to be thinking this way. But I agree with you. When there's instability and insecurity, it's hard to create change.
Another challenge I think that really isn't talked about, but may be part of the difficulty moving forward with initiatives and collaboration, is the difference in expected longevity between people who are, especially in the academic side, faculty,
Yep.
and then deans, provosts, presidents, chancellors, who may be on a different kind of career path,
Right.
different kind of time cycle.
Yep.
And how is it that those who are going to be there for the long haul believe that this initiative is going to work when the last 3 or 4 got started and somebody passed the road to someplace else? And that brings up another point
Yep.
that I don't think we explicitly addressed. We need to have, I think, a way to celebrate successes, to reward whether it's extrinsic or intrinsic reward.
Yep.
And we need to find ways to get people on board, maybe more than what's happening.
I think that's a great point. I think recognizing successes is something that's critically important, and it is about creating a culture shift and getting people on board. But you're right, the leadership challenge is a big one. I think the average CAO lifespan now in SUNY is about 3.5, 4 years. Now, they're just, we're churning through pretty quickly. So, I mean, you're right, that sort of instability also with the workforce does create other challenges. We're done? We've gone over. So anyway, thank you all so much for coming out this morning. Really do appreciate it.